Leah moved cautiously through the dimly lit corridors of the research facility, her heart pounding against her ribs. She wasn't supposed to be here. The lab was off-limits after hours, restricted to only a few senior scientists. But she couldn't ignore her curiosity. Something about this place had always seemed strange to her. The way certain doors required extra clearance, the whispers between scientists when they thought no one was listening, and the rumors of secret experiments that never appeared in official reports. Tonight, she had decided to find out the truth for herself. She walked past rows of metal shelves, lined with vials of glowing liquid and sealed containers marked with biohazard warnings. The air smelled sterile, with a faint metallic tang. Her footsteps were almost silent against the polished floor. The lab was colder than she expected, sending a shiver down her spine. A single overhead light flickered, casting eerie shadows along the walls. Leah stopped in front of a door labeled Restricted Access, Level 5. She had seen this door many times before, but had never been allowed inside. Her hands trembled as she pulled out a stolen access card and swiped it against the scanner. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a soft peep, the door clicked open. She held her breath and stepped inside. The room was different from the others. Unlike the sterile, organized spaces in the rest of the facility, this lab looked chaotic. Papers were scattered across desks, monitors displayed unreadable data, and strange equipment hummed with energy. In the center of the room stood a glass containment unit filled with a swirling golden mist. The sight of it made her uneasy, but she couldn't look away. It seemed almost alive, shifting and pulsing as if reacting to her presence. Her fingers tingled with excitement as she moved closer, scanning the notes left behind. Most of the writing was in scientific code, but a few phrases stood out. Subject reaction unpredictable. Rapid genetic changes observed. Caution. Pheromone exposure may trigger transformation beyond human limits. Leah frowned. Pheromones. Transformation. She didn't understand, but she could feel the weight of something important hidden in those words. She leaned in, pressing her face closer to the glass. Her breath fogged up the surface. Just as she was about to step back, the containment unit let out a soft hiss. A tiny crack formed in the glass. Before she could react, a faint wisp of the golden mist escaped and curled toward her like a living thing. Leah gasped and stumbled backward. But it was too late. The mist was already in the air around her. She squeezed her eyes shut and held her breath, but a small amount must have slipped through. A strange warmth spread through her chest, like a sudden rush of adrenaline. Her skin prickled and her head spun. She staggered, grabbing onto the edge of the desk for support. Her breathing was rapid, her heart racing. The sensation grew stronger, spreading down her arms, into her fingertips, and through her legs. It was like fire and ice at the same time, a tingling that made her want to scratch at her skin, but she couldn't move. Her limbs felt heavy, her vision blurring around the edges. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the feeling settled. She forced herself to take slow breaths, steadying her shaking hands. Maybe it was just her imagination. Maybe the mist hadn't done anything at all. She needed to leave. Now. Leah turned and hurried out of the room, her legs unsteady but moving on instinct. She retraced her steps through the dark corridors, swiping her stolen card at every locked door. Each second felt like an eternity. She was sure someone would catch her. Every shadow seemed to shift. Every sound made her flinch. By the time she reached the exit, her forehead was damp with sweat. She stepped outside into the cold night air and inhaled deeply, trying to clear her head. The mist was probably harmless. If it was dangerous, the scientists wouldn't have kept it in such a fragile container, right? She convinced herself it was nothing. Just a harmless chemical. Just another failed experiment. But deep down, a small voice whispered that she was wrong. The drive home felt longer than usual. The streetlights stretched into blurs of white and yellow, and the hum of the car engine felt distant. Her body still tingled, but she ignored it. Maybe it was just nerves. She had just broken into a top-level lab and stolen classified information. Of course, she was anxious. She pulled into her apartment parking lot and sat in the driver's seat for a moment, gripping the steering wheel. Everything would be fine. She just needed sleep. In the morning, this would all feel like a dream. Leia pushed open her apartment door and locked it behind her. The room was dark and quiet. She kicked off her shoes, dropped her bag on the counter, and made her way to the bathroom. She flipped on the light and looked at herself in the mirror. At first, nothing seemed different. Her dark hair was a little messy, her hazel eyes tired. But as she leaned in closer, she noticed something that made her stomach drop. Her eyes weren't the same. The color was wrong. A faint glow shimmered in the depths of her irises, barely noticeable but undeniably there. She blinked rapidly, shaking her head. Maybe it was just the light playing tricks on her. Maybe she was just exhausted. She splashed cold water on her face, breathing deeply. When she looked again, the glow was gone. She let out a shaky laugh. She was letting her paranoia hit the best of her. Turning off the light, she stumbled into bed, pulling the covers over herself. Sleep would fix everything. Tomorrow, she would wake up, go to work, and pretend nothing had happened. But as she drifted off, a strange warmth spread through her again, this time deeper. Her muscles twitched in her sleep. Her fingers curled involuntarily. And in the darkness, just beneath her skin, something began to change. Leia woke up with a jolt, gasping for air. Her body was burning, not with pain but with something deeper, something strange. She sat up, her breath ragged, and looked around. The dim glow of the streetlights outside cast long shadows across her bedroom. For a moment, she struggled to remember where she was. Then, the events of the previous night flooded back into her mind. The lab, the mist, the glow in her eyes. She swallowed hard and wiped the sweat from her forehead. Maybe it had all been a bad dream. Maybe she was just stressed, overworked. She forced herself to breathe slowly, trying to shake the uneasy feeling creeping through her. But as she moved to stand up, something felt wrong. Her body was different. Her heartbeat was too loud, pounding in her ears like a drum. Every sound in the apartment seemed sharper. The hum of the refrigerator, the ticking of the clock, the distant sound of a car passing outside. Even her own breathing felt magnified. She clenched her fists, trying to calm the strange sensation crawling beneath her skin. Walking to the bathroom, she flipped on the light and froze. The mirror didn't lie. Her eyes were glowing again, brighter than before. Not just a trick of the light, not just exhaustion. The golden shimmer pulsed faintly in her irises, as if something inside her was waking up. She reached up, pressing her fingers against her temples. This wasn't normal. This wasn't human. Her stomach twisted. What had she inhaled? What was it doing to her? A sudden sharp pain shot through her spine, and she gasped, gripping the edge of the sink for support. It felt like something was shifting inside her, like her bones were stretching. She clamped a hand over her mouth to keep from crying out, her body trembling as another wave of heat rolled through her. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the pain stopped. Her breaths came in short, panicked gasps. She looked down at her hands. They were the same. No claws, no strange colors. Just hands. But when she flexed her fingers, something felt different. Stronger, more controlled. As if there was a power waiting beneath the surface, ready to be unleashed. No, she was imagining things. She had to be. She turned away from the mirror and stumbled back into her bedroom. Grabbing her phone, she quickly searched for any information on Project Evolution. Nothing. No public records, no leaked files, nothing about pheromones or genetic changes. It was as if the experiment didn't exist. Her mind raced. If the government was hiding something this big, there had to be a reason. A sudden knock at the door made her jump. She froze, her heart pounding even louder than before. No one visited her this early. She hesitated before walking to the door, her fingers hovering over the handle. Another knock. more forceful this time. Leah's pulse quickened. Whoever was on the other side wasn't just here for a friendly chat. She took a slow breath and opened the door just enough to see outside. A man in a dark suit stood there, his face unreadable. Behind him. "You said." Leah's grip on the door tightened as she stared at the man in the dark suit. His expression was unreadable, his stance rigid. Behind him, the other two figures stood still, watching her closely. A cold dread settled in her stomach. She didn't know who they were, but she was certain of one thing. They weren't here by accident. "Miss Carter," the man said again, his voice calm but firm. "We need to ask you a few questions." Leah forced herself to stay still, to not let the panic show on her face. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice steady despite the unease creeping through her. The man pulled out a badge, flipping it open for just a second before snapping it shut again. "Government investigation. There was an incident last night at the lab where you work. We believe you may have been there after hours." Her throat went dry. They knew. She forced a confused look onto her face. "I don't know what you're talking about. I left work at my usual time." The man tilted his head slightly, as if studying her. "We have security footage," he said. "Would you like to reconsider your answer?" Leah's mind raced. Of course, there were cameras. How could she have been so stupid? She had been careful, but not careful enough. She needed to get out of this conversation. Fast. She let out a shaky sigh. I did stay late," she admitted, pretending to be nervous. "I was finishing up some reports. But I didn't see anything unusual. I wasn't even near the restricted areas." The man's sharp gaze didn't waver. "Then you wouldn't mind coming with us to answer a few more questions?" Every instinct in her body screamed no. If she got into that car, she wasn't coming back. She forced a hesitant nod. "Let me just grab my coat." She shut the door without waiting for an answer, her hand shaking as she turned back into the apartment. She didn't have much time. They were watching her. She could feel it. Her heart pounded as she moved toward the back window. The alley behind her building was empty. If she could slip out before they realized what she was doing. A sudden knock made her jump. "Miss Carter, open the door." She didn't respond. She yanked the window open and swung her legs over the ledge. The cold morning air hit her like a slap, but she didn't stop. She climbed down as fast as she could, her fingers gripping the rough brick. A shout rang out behind her. "She's running." Leah didn't look back. She dropped the last few feet, landing hard on the pavement before breaking into a sprint. The moment her feet hit the ground, she realized something was different. She was faster, much faster. Her legs moved with an ease she had never felt before, as if her body knew exactly what to do. The sound of footsteps followed her, but they were too slow. She was already half a block away before they even reached the alley. She turned a corner, ducking into another street, her pulse hammering in her ears. She needed to think. She needed to figure out what was happening to her. And most importantly, she needed to disappear. Leah didn't stop running until she reached the outskirts of the city. She had no plan, no destination. All she knew was that she had to get away. Whatever was happening to her wasn't just in her head. She had felt it when she ran. Her speed, her strength, her body was changing. She stopped near an old abandoned warehouse, her chest rising and falling with heavy breaths. Her hands were still shaking. What had she done? What had she become? She pulled out her phone, her fingers hovering over the screen. She couldn't call anyone. Not her coworkers, not her friends. She didn't know who she could trust. A rustling sound made her freeze. She spun around, every muscle in her body tense. The street was empty. No people, no cars, nothing but the distant sound of the city. Then she heard it again, a whisper of movement, too quiet for a normal human to notice. She wasn't alone. "Who's there?" she demanded, her voice sharper than she expected. Silence. Then, from the shadows, a figure stepped forward. It was a man, tall, dressed in dark clothes, but there was something off about him. His eyes glowed faintly, the same unnatural shimmer that Leia had seen in her own reflection. "You need to come with me," he said, his voice low and urgent. Leia took a step back. "Who are you?" "I don't have time to explain," he said. "They're tracking you. If you stay here, they'll find you." Her mind screamed trap, but something in his tone made her hesitate. He didn't sound like the agents. He sounded like someone running just like her. "How do I know I can trust you?" she asked. "You don't," he admitted, "but you don't have a choice." Behind her, a distant rumble filled the air. A low hum, almost mechanical. Leia turned her head just in time to see a dark vehicle speeding toward them. "They're here," the man said. "Decide now." Leia clenched her jaw. Then she ran, this time, following him into the unknown. Leia ran without thinking, her feet pounding against the pavement as she followed the mysterious man through the darkened streets. The air was thick with tension, the distant hum of the approaching vehicle growing louder behind them. Whoever these people were, they weren't going to let her escape so easily. The man led her down a narrow alley, weaving through rusted fire escapes and abandoned trash bins with effortless speed. Leia kept up, but something inside her told her she wasn't just keeping up. She was faster than she had ever been before. The wind rushed past her face, her muscles moving in perfect sync, as if her body had been built for this. "Who are they?" she gasped, glancing over her shoulder. The black vehicle skidded into the alleyway, its headlights slicing through the darkness. The doors flung open, and 3 agents spilled out, their weapons drawn. Not the kind of people you want to get caught by. The man answered without breaking stride. A gunshot rang out, the bullet sparking against the brick wall inches from Leia's shoulder. She flinched but didn't slow down. Her instincts screamed at her to move, to run, to survive. "They're shooting at us," she shouted. "Yeah, noticed that," the man muttered. He suddenly veered left, grabbing her arm and yanking her into another alley. The walls were tight, barely enough space for them to squeeze through. Leia's breath came fast and sharp. She could hear the agents behind them, their heavy boots slamming against the pavement. The man ahead of her moved like a ghost, his body fluid and controlled. He wasn't just fast, he was trained. Leia had no idea who he was, but he was leading her away from danger. And right now, that was all that mattered. They burst out onto another street, the city lights stretching into the distance. The man scanned their surroundings quickly before gripping her wrist. "There," he said, pointing to an old drainage tunnel beneath a bridge. "You want us to go in there?" Leia asked, eyes widening. "Unless you want to get caught." Another shot rang out. Leia didn't argue. She bolted toward the tunnel, ducking inside just as more bullets ricocheted off the concrete behind her. The passage was damp and smelled of rust and mildew, but it provided cover. They kept running, their footsteps echoing in the darkness. After what felt like forever, the tunnel widened into an open space beneath the bridge. The man finally stopped, pressing his back against the wall and catching his breath. Leia doubled over, her hands on her knees, her lungs burning. We lost them," she asked between gasps. "For now," he said. Leia wiped the sweat from her brow and straightened, her eyes locking onto his. "Who the hell are you?" He studied her for a moment before answering. "Name's Dorian. And you?" "Leia." Dorian nodded, as if the name confirmed something. "You don't know what's happening to you, do you?" Leia tensed. "I know I inhaled something in that lab. I know my body is changing. And I know the government is trying to take me." "They're not just the government," Dorian said. "They're part of a classified division, Project Evolution." Leia's blood ran cold. She had seen that name before, buried in the files in the lab. "What do they want with me?" Dorian exhaled slowly. "You're not the first one they've experimented on." Leia felt the weight of his words settle in her chest. "And you?" she asked. His golden eyes flickered in the dim light. "Let's just say, I was in your position once." Her mind spun with questions, But before she could speak, a faint clicking noise echoed through the tunnel. Dorian tensed. They're tracking us. Laya's pulse quickened. How? They have ways. He grabbed her hand and pulled her forward. We have to move. Now. Leah didn't hesitate. She ran, deeper into the unknown, with danger right on her heels. Leah's breath came in short, sharp bursts as she ran, her legs burning from the relentless pace. The tunnel stretched endlessly ahead, the air thick with the scent of rust and damp concrete. Behind her, the faint clicking noise grew louder. Whatever was tracking them wasn't giving up. Dorian moved like a shadow, his grip firm on her wrist as he guided her through the darkness. He never hesitated, never slowed, as if he knew exactly where they were going. Laya's heart pounded. She didn't trust him, not fully, but he was her only chance at surviving this. The tunnel took a sharp turn, opening into a wider chamber. Dim emergency lights flickered overhead, casting eerie shadows on the walls. Dorian suddenly stopped, his hand shooting up in a silent command for Laya to freeze. She obeyed, swallowing hard. What is it? She whispered. Dorian's golden eyes scanned the chamber, his muscles tense. They're close, he murmured. Too close. Laya's skin prickled. The clicking sound had stopped. The silence was worse. Then, movement. A dark figure dropped from the ceiling, landing in a crouch a few feet away. Another stepped from the shadows, followed by a third. Laya's stomach twisted. They weren't normal agents. Their eyes glowed like Dorian's. Dorian cursed under his breath. They sent hunters. The tallest of the three took a step forward, his gaze fixed on Laya. His expression was unreadable, but there was something unnerving about the way he watched her, like a predator sizing up prey. You've caused quite a mess, he said, his voice smooth, almost amused. The director wants you back. Alive, if possible. Laya's fists clenched. Not happening. The hunter smirked. That's what they all say at first. Then he moved. Faster than Laya could react, he lunged at her. A blur of motion, too quick for the human eye to follow. But Laya wasn't just human anymore. Her body reacted on instinct. She ducked, pivoting to the side as the hunter's hand sliced through the air, where she had been standing a fraction of a second ago. Without thinking, she lashed out with her foot, aiming for his ribs. Her strike landed. The hunter was thrown backward, slamming into the concrete wall with enough force to crack it. Laya froze, staring at her own foot in shock. Had she just done that? The hunter groaned, pushing himself up with a scowl. That's new. Dorian didn't waste time. He moved like lightning, striking the second hunter before he could react. The tunnel exploded into chaos. Blows exchanged, bodies moving at impossible speeds, the air thick with tension. Laya barely had time to react before the third hunter was on her. He swung at her, but something inside her had awakened. She dodged effortlessly, her senses heightened, her reflexes sharper than ever before. It was as if her body knew exactly what to do. She struck again, faster this time. Her fist connected with the hunter's chest, sending him flying back. Dorian fought with brutal precision, taking down his opponent with practiced ease. He turned to Leah, eyes wide with something between surprise and approval. You're adapting fast, he said. Laya barely had time to process his words before the first hunter, now furious, charged at her again. But this time, she was ready. She met him head-on. The fight was over in seconds. Laya didn't remember how she moved, only that she did. A twist, a strike, a final blow that sent the hunter sprawling to the ground, unconscious. Silence. Laya stood there, breathing hard, her hands trembling. Not from fear, but from something else. Power. She turned to Dorian, her heart hammering. What's happening to me? Dorian studied her for a long moment before answering. You're waking up. Leah swallowed, trying to process what had just happened. She had fought 3 trained killers and won. She wasn't just stronger, she was becoming something else. Dorian grabbed her arm. We have to move. More will come. Leah nodded, but as they ran deeper into the darkness, one thought consumed her. If this was just the beginning, what was she turning into? Leah ran beside Dorian, her body moving faster, smoother than it ever had before. Her heart pounded, not just from exertion, but from the realization that something inside her had awakened. She wasn't normal anymore. She had fought those hunters, and won. The raw power still pulsed through her veins, electric and intoxicating. But it also terrified her. Dorian didn't speak as they moved deeper into the underground tunnels. The air was damp, heavy with the scent of rust and old water. Their footsteps echoed against the concrete walls, the only sound in the suffocating silence. Finally, they reached a metal door, rusted at the edges. Dorian pressed his palm against it, and with a low groan, it slid open. Leah followed him inside, stepping into what looked like an old abandoned subway station. The space was dimly lit by flickering emergency lights. Broken benches and shattered glass littered the ground. But what caught Leah's attention was the network of makeshift equipment scattered around. Computers, weapons, medical supplies. This wasn't just a hideout. It was a base. Dorian turned to face her, his golden eyes unreadable. "You need answers," he said. Leah crossed her arms. "Yeah, no kidding." He exhaled, running a hand through his dark hair. "What do you remember about the night you inhaled the compound?" Leah frowned. "Not much. I was working late at the lab. I smelled something strange. And then, everything changed." She hesitated. "I thought it was a chemical accident. But it wasn't, was it?" Dorian shook his head. "No, it was never an accident." A cold knot twisted in her stomach. Then what was it? Dorian leaned against a rusted control panel, watching her closely. Project Evolution has been experimenting on humans for years, trying to create something more. Stronger, faster, more resilient. But the process was never stable. Leah swallowed hard. "You're saying they were trying to turn people into this?" She gestured to herself, remembering the way she had moved. Fought. "They've been failing for a long time," Dorian said. "Until now." She stared at him, realization creeping in. "You think I'm a success?" Dorian nodded. "The first natural mutation. No implants, no forced modifications. Whatever you breathed in triggered something in your DNA. Your body is changing on its own." Leah took a shaky breath, her fingers curling into fists. "And the hunters? They were failed experiments," Dorian said. "Part of Project Evolution's early trials. They survived, but they weren't stable. That's why they follow orders. Because without control, they fall apart." Leah shivered. She remembered the way they had moved, the eerie glow of their eyes. Monsters created by the same people who now wanted her back. She looked up at Dorian. "You said you were in my position once. What did they do to you?" For the first time, something flickered in his expression, something almost painful. "I wasn't born like this," he admitted. "I was taken, modified, turned into something else." He glanced at his hands, flexing his fingers. "But it wasn't perfect. They couldn't fully control me." Leah's breath caught in her throat. "So you escaped?" Dorian's jaw tightened. "I survived." A heavy silence stretched between them. Then Leah clenched her fists. "If they're hunting me, if they won't stop until they get me back, then I won't run anymore." She met Dorian's gaze, her voice steady. "I want to fight." Dorian studied her for a long moment. "You don't know what you're asking for." Leah's heartbeat thundered, but her fear was drowned out by something stronger. Determination. "I need to know what I am," she said. "I need to know what they did to me." Dorian exhaled slowly. Then, finally, he nodded. "Then we start now." Hours later, Leah stood in the middle of an open training area in the abandoned station. The cold air bit at her skin, but she barely felt it. Every nerve in her body was on edge, her muscles tense. Dorian circled her like a predator, his eyes sharp, calculating. "Your body is adapting fast," he said. "But raw power isn't enough. You need control." Leah squared her shoulders. "Then show me." He moved without warning. 1 second he was standing a few feet away. The next he was in front of her, striking out with lightning speed. Leah barely dodged, her instincts kicking in just in time. She twisted away, her heart hammering. "Too slow," Dorian said. He struck again, but this time, Leah didn't just react, she countered. She caught his wrist mid-swing, twisting sharply. Dorian grunted but flipped effortlessly, slipping out of her grip. He was fast, unbelievably fast. But so was she. Leah lunged, aiming a kick at his side. Dorian blocked, the impact echoing through the station. The force of it sent him skidding back slightly, and for the first time, she saw it, approval in his eyes. "Good," he murmured. Leah didn't let up. She moved again, faster, stronger. Each strike was sharper, each movement more precise. She wasn't just fighting, she was learning. Her body adjusted, adapting to his speed, his techniques. She could feel herself evolving. Then suddenly, she saw an opening. Dorian threw a punch. She ducked, then twisted, sweeping his legs out from under him. He hit the ground with a thud. For a moment, there was silence. Then, Dorian laughed. A short, sharp sound. "You're a quick learner." Leah grinned, breathless. "You're not so bad yourself." Dorian pushed himself up, dusting off his jacket. "Don't get cocky." Leah's smile faded slightly. "How much time do we have before they find us again?" Dorian's expression darkened. "Not long." Leah nodded, determination settling in her chest. "Then we make the most of it." Dorian watched her for a moment, then nodded. "Tomorrow," he said, "we go after them." Leah's pulse quickened. She had spent days running, hiding. But now she was done being prey. It was time to become the hunter. Leah stood at the edge of the abandoned station, staring into the darkness of the tunnel ahead. Her heart pounded, not from fear, but from anticipation. She had spent days running, hiding, questioning what was happening to her. But now she knew. She wasn't just changing. She was becoming. Dorian stood beside her, his golden eyes fixed ahead. He had spent the last 24 hours training her, sharpening her instincts, pushing her to the edge of her limits. But even he didn't know how far she could go. "We hit them fast," Dorian said. "No hesitation. We get inside, destroy their lab, and take down anyone who stands in our way." Leah clenched her fists. "And if the director is there?" Dorian's jaw tightened. "Then we finish this." Leah exhaled slowly. She wasn't the same girl who had stumbled out of that lab, confused and afraid. Now she was something more. Something powerful. And it was time to show them what they had created. They moved through the tunnels like ghosts, their footsteps silent against the concrete. The deeper they went, the more the air changed, colder, heavier. Then, ahead, a steel door stood embedded in the tunnel wall. A hidden entrance. Dorian pulled out a small device and pressed it against the keypad. The red light flickered, then turned green with a soft peep. The door slid open. Leah tensed. "They'll know we're here." Dorian smirked. "Good." They slipped inside. The hallway was sterile, white walls lined with reinforced glass windows. Beyond them, Leah could see rows of equipment, machines monitoring test subjects, strange chemicals bubbling in vials. It looked exactly like the lab she had worked in before, but now she understood what it really was: a factory for monsters. Alarms suddenly blared. Red lights flashed overhead, and within seconds, the hallway filled with movement. Guards stormed in, their weapons raised. Dorian moved first, a blur of motion as he slammed into the nearest guard, knocking him out before he could fire. Leah followed instinctively, her body reacting before she even thought about it. The first guard swung at her. She ducked, twisting behind him, and drove her elbow into his ribs. He crumpled. Another came at her, but she was faster, stronger. She grabbed his wrist, twisted, and sent him flying into the wall. More footsteps, more guards, but Laia barely registered them. She felt everything. The rush of movement. The way time seemed to slow when she focused. It was like her body knew what to do before her mind even processed it. A shot rang out. She turned just in time to see a guard aiming at Dorian. Without thinking, she moved. 1 second she was across the hallway. The next, she was in front of him, her hand snapping up. The bullet stopped. Mid-air. For a heartbeat, everything froze. Leah stared at the bullet hovering just inches from her palm. It vibrated slightly, caught in an invisible force she didn't understand. Then, as if time returned to normal, it dropped harmlessly to the floor. Dorian's eyes widened. Laia barely had time to process what she had just done before more guards flooded the hallway. "We need to move," Dorian said, snapping back to reality. Leah nodded. There would be time for questions later. Right now, they had a mission. They fought their way through the lab, cutting down anyone who stood in their way. Laia barely felt the strain. Her body moved effortlessly, her strength endless. Every time she struck, her power grew. She was faster, stronger, unstoppable. Then they reached the main chamber. The room was massive, filled with towering machines and glowing containment pods, and at the center, standing on an elevated platform, was him, the director. He was tall, his white coat pristine, his expression unreadable. Around him, a dozen hunters stood in formation, their glowing eyes locked onto Laia and Dorian. The director smiled. "I was hoping you'd come." Leah clenched her fists. "You did this to me. I perfected you," he corrected. "And look at you now, stronger than I ever imagined." Laia's body tensed. She could feel something inside her, boiling, rising. "You turned people into monsters." The director sighed. "Such a harsh word. Evolution requires sacrifice. Leah, you are living proof of that." She took a step forward, but the hunters moved, blocking her path. The director raised a hand. "You could still be part of this, you know. Join us. Think of what we could accomplish together." Laia's muscles coiled. Then she smiled. "Here's my answer." And she attacked. The room exploded into chaos. Laia struck first, launching herself at the nearest hunter. He barely had time to react before she drove her fist into his chest, sending him flying across the room. Another lunged at her. She dodged effortlessly, grabbing his arm and twisting. Bones snapped. He screamed. Dorian fought beside her, moving with deadly precision. The hunters were fast, but they weren't fast enough. Laia felt it, the raw power coursing through her. Every movement, every strike, was perfect. She dodged, countered, struck again. It was like her body wasn't even hers anymore. It was something more, something greater. Then she locked eyes with the director. He was watching her, his expression unreadable. Then slowly he stepped down from the platform, hands still calmly folded behind his back. "Impressive," he said, "but let's see how far you can go." And then he moved. Laia barely saw it coming. 1 second, he was across the room. The next, he was in front of her, striking with inhuman speed. She dodged, but he anticipated it, twisting and slamming his fist into her stomach. Pain exploded through her body. She flew backward, crashing into a metal console. Sparks erupted around her. Dorian shouted something, but she couldn't hear him. The director straightened. "You see, Leah, you are powerful, but you are not the only one." Leah coughed, struggling to stand. But something felt off. Her limbs felt heavier. Her vision blurred. Poison. She looked down. A tiny injection mark on her arm. She hadn't even noticed it. The director smiled. "Did you think I wouldn't prepare for you?" Laia's legs wobbled. The strength in her body was fading fast. She tried to fight it, but her vision darkened. The last thing she saw was Dorian lunging at the director. Then, blackness. Leia woke up to the sound of distant sirens. Her head throbbed, her body aching. She was lying in the back of a speeding vehicle. Dorian sat beside her, his expression grim. We barely made it out. Leia blinked, her mind spinning. The lab. Destroyed, Dorian said. But the director, he's still out there. Leia exhaled, staring up at the night sky through the window. It wasn't over. Not yet. But next time, she would be ready.